Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Geopolitics with Tyberius D. Today we're going to be talking about the failed superpower, one of the most powerful nations to have ever existed, and is now a shadow of its former self. We're going to be talking about the Russian history after our follow-up from the Spotlight. Roll the intro. Okay, everyone. I'm sorry about that. I haven't been here for the better part of a week, and I apologize for that. And that's not only on stream, but that's for this content. Is that I had a little bit of a backlog starting to build up, and then everything went to hell. And yeah, I couldn't even really do anything for a week. I've had a number of things go on that is just absolutely not good, and it's literally just been one thing after another after another. So, two things. I do apologize for not being here. My viewership, obviously, on Twitch right now is pretty down low. And then I'm sure people not having their constant YouTube content doesn't help me at all either. Forgive me, I'm human. I do, have to stop from time to time. A lot of it's been personal. Dealing with school has also been a problem. I've had some family issues. And, of course, between this being lower and my job actually being lower hours, I'm running short on cash too. So across the board, I'm a little on the screwed side. So if you want to help me out, I'd appreciate it. If you want to just send me a message and be like, hey, you good? That'd be appreciated too. Anyway, without further ado, I'm just going to jump into the content. Let's give you guys what you want. We're going to talk about Russian history. So the last episode we did the Spotlight. We're talking about where Russia is today. We're going to talk about where Russia was, how they got to where they were today, and then we're going to be talking about where they might be going forward. And of course, I largely answered a little bit of that in the last episode. So, today, Russian history. Our story largely begins back all the way in the 1300s. Now, the Russian people have existed for quite a long while, and of course, ethnicity is a weird conversation when one starts and ends. But a lot of people consider the beginning of Russian history to be the Kievan Rus, which is weird because it's like Ukrainians ruling the Russians. It's just a little strange. But the Kievan Rus was a empire largely set out of Kiev, or Kiev, 1,000 years ago, and it was largely kind of an outpost of the Hungarian guards. Out of okay, long story short, they were literally Vikings who went down to the Byzantine Empire, held out for a little bit, and then came back up into Ukraine, into the Dnieper River Valley, and settled and built themselves a nice little empire. So, weird little thing going on. But yeah, the Vikings actually got all the way down to Turkey and whatnot, which a lot of people don't know. So, that kind of helps cement who the Russians will be eventually. But our story largely starts in the 1300s with a little country known as the Principality of Muscovy, or the Grand Duchy of Muscovy. And it'll change names a few times. But largely what it is that it's a nexus around Moscow, where a lot of trade and a lot of important matters are going on. And what is the reason why this is a powerful place is two reasons. Number one is that there is something off to the east called the Golden Horde. And that is one of the Mongol successor states. And the Golden Horde is one of the four major states that largely rules far Eastern Europe and Western Asia, and that'll control everything from basically the Ural Mountains all the way down into the Caucasus, and it will largely shrink in size as time goes on. But what will largely happen here is that they will subjugate quite a number of institutions and a number of geopolitical forces under their banner, and one of them is the Grand Duchy of Muscovy. What largely comes about here is that the other side of this is that Moscow is in a very central core part of the Russian lands, and they are able to use their viceroyship of this given area and being basically the enforcers for the Golden Horde for quite a while to extort everyone around them. And so they're able to either force the trade in that they can tax the revenue that comes through the trade, or anytime that somebody gets out of line, they largely can come in with either the backing of the Golden Horde or themselves, and they can come in and largely force their terms and conditions on others. After about 100 years of this, the Grand Duchy will get strong enough where they will openly break away from the Golden Horde. I can't remember exactly when this is, but it's sometime before 1444. Largely what will happen is that the Grand Duchy gets pretty powerful, and them and a number of Russian successor states will break away from the Golden Horde, and the Golden Horde is largely put on its last legs. It will take some time before the Golden Horde is finally defeated, and we'll definitely be getting back to that. But largely what has happened is that the Russians as a people are now largely liberated and have their own destiny in their hands. You have a number of states that are left over in the wake of this. Some of them are relatively large, such as the Principality of Novgorod, and you'll largely have the Grand Duchy of Moscow, along with Muscovy, along with a number of other ones that are a little bit smaller and a little bit more parsed out. I believe there's one called Perm. I believe there's another one at Tula. There's another one at Pskov. There's quite a few of these spread out a bunch of each other. Some of them are quite sizable. Some of them aren't really anything to to write home about. And it's kind of like a weird Holy Roman Empire kind of situation all over again. Get a little hot here. Let me turn that on. I forgot to clean that up. Sorry, my dogs are quite fun. Anyway, to address what is going on here is that the Russians will largely be able, the Grand Duchy Muscovy will over time start eking out and conquering out the areas around them. And the reason why is that geopolitically is that Moscow is vulnerable. If you look in just about any direction of Moscow, it's just flat land. And this flat land is so flat it makes Kansas look hilly. It's quite impressive, actually. So you'll see some forested trees here. You'll have all this, and it's largely getting into areas that we'll find like in the lower parts of Canada. So it gets pretty cold during the winter. But these people are very hardy, they're very capable, and they will eventually start working out into the zones around them to largely secure a geopolitical position. What eventually will happen is that under, I believe it's Ivan IV, and this is Ivan the Terrible, you will have the formation of the Zardom of Russia. And what largely to signify is this. We have transformed ourselves from the great state of Muscovy into a geopolitical entity that includes all of the Rus people, and thus we are now the land of the Rus, or known as Russia or Russia. This largely happens by like 1530, if I remember right, and I apologize, it's been a while since I've really digged into Russian history. I need to do it again, but I know what largely happens in a journal scheme, I just don't remember the exact date, so I apologize. But anyway, you have the Zardom of Russia form, and it's no joke. It's absolutely a Leviathan in Eastern Europe. This is quite a large area, and they will continue to expand once they have united themselves into a greater whole, faster and faster, and subjugating more and more peoples under their aegis. And eventually this will become known as the Russian Empire. And it's basically the formation of the Russian Empire, more or less, at this point. There is a Zardom of Russia, and then there will eventually be the Russian Empire, and that's largely more or less formed under Peter the Great. And that's more when Russia goes from being kind of a backwater to being a major great power of the world, and they'll largely retain that power all the way up till this very day. So, Zardom of Russia largely forms. And I can't remember exactly if this event happens before, during, or a little bit after the Zardom of Russia, but it will be an integral part of Russian history, and I think it's a little bit of one of those forever moments that kind of keeps coming back to hit them. The Golden Horde was not ruling the Russians directly because it was largely supplanted by a different kind of people, and these people are known as the Tartars. Now there's a few other peoples that get involved with this, the Kazakhs, the Crimeans, which used to be a people, they're not anymore, but a whole bunch of peoples that used to be largely Islamic and largely, I can't remember what the word is for them. They were largely outsiders to Europe. They had largely either settled around the northern part of the Caspian Sea during the Great Migrations, or they largely had seen themselves as significantly different. That's kind of changed now, because even the Kazakhstan kind of thinks of themselves as European now, and it's really weird. But anyway, what I'm getting at is that these peoples back then did not inflict themselves as Russian, did not believe themselves as Russian, largely practices of the Islamic faith, and were known as different peoples that stretch back from the time of modern, and that is largely the people that we're talking about here is the Tartars. Now, back then, this place used to be known as Tataria. Today, we now know this region as Tartarstan. But this was the gravitational center of the Golden Horde, and as it slowly lost its power, the Russians would largely come in and eat it out, either by having somebody else help tag team them and break it down, or more or less the Russians would get stronger and stronger and stronger as they united, and so they would come in and work it all down and break it all up. There's a problem here with Russian history, and this is going to sound horrible, but I can't say it in any other way. What most of Russia would do throughout all of its history is that once it united Russia under its main aegis, where all the Russians were largely the same people, it acted as largely an ethno-state that would go about and try to supplant people and Russify them. Either they would do one of three things. One, they would come in, they would teach people Russian, they'd be like, hey, look, you're a lot like Russia, you can be Russian too. Learn our language, accept yourself as Russian, it'll be golden, it'll be great. They did have some success with this, actually. It's kind of like they did kind of think of themselves as the third Rome. There is a long conversation about that, but I'm not going to get there. Other times, what they would do is that they would just move a bunch of Russians in. It's basically kind of a Lebensraum kind of thing, and they would kind of ethnically colonize the area and just dominate the area in an ethnocentric way, to the point where if it wasn't fully Russian, it'd be Russian enough to where they wouldn't have to deal with a local minority in any kind of presentable way. Number three is that one or two things, A or B category. A, the Russians would come in and you were seen as a mortal enemy of the Russian people and you were destroyed. This is a little bit rare in Russian history, but they would do it, and they took this thing out of the Romans to some degree. B was that they would come in, and if you didn't subject yourself to largely Russification, you would slowly be starved out. And if you actually look in Russian history for the better part of the last 5 centuries, what you can find is about every 40 years or so, the Russians have a nasty habit of just starving the crap out of people. Sometimes it's precipitated by a famine, but what you'll notice is that the people who get starved are the people that usually live in the grain-producing areas, and the people who actually get the food are the Russian people, which don't live in those areas. And so this has largely been the Russian MMO for many, many years now, so they basically get to go in and colonize the area, take it over, and Russify it. And so through any of that doctrine that we had largely pulled down as ethnocentric, the Russians started building up a major geopolitical empire that lasted this very day. Screwed up a little bit. The reason that I brought up the Tartars is that there is an area that we still call Tataria or Tartarstan that has never been Russified. And that was largely because during the formation of Russia, a little bit before, during, and after, is that the first area that they really got into and conquered was an area called Kazan. This used to be like the remnant of the Golden Horde, the Khanate of Kazan. What this was basically the core of the Tartar people. And before the Russians could assemble themselves into a major unified geopolitical entity, they had to deal with them. And this is one of the reasons why they can actually form the Zardom outright, is they largely are able to destroy their number one enemy of another peoples. And they basically unite the Russian peoples in that great battle to destroy them. What largely doesn't happen, though, because this is before the Russian MO really takes off, is that they don't subject this area to Russification and colonization. And so, right in the middle of Russia, not even a couple hundred miles to the east of Moscow, you've got a major area of people who do not associate themselves as Russian, do not they do not see themselves as Russian, identify as Russian, or even like the Russians. And most of Russian history has been premeditated on keeping the Tartars in line. And it's been very bloody and very nasty for them. Now, largely what happened is once the Zardom of Russia formed, the Tartars could never break away, and even though they would try once or twice to have some level of revolt, revolution, what call you, is that they were never able to throw off the yoke of the Russian yoke to the point where they could have independence again. And the entire point of the Russian mindset is that if Tartaria ever becomes its own country again, they're screwed. Because now, what they actually did, and this is kind of weird, is that the Russian heartland is literally divided in two, and it's split because of Tartaria, to where You have Moscow and St. Petersburg and Volgograd down on the east or on the western side of this, and then all of a sudden you've got Tatarstan, and then you've got the entire Siberian Causeway that follows the Great Siberian Railroad, which are is a belt of Russian people extending all the way out to Vladivostok on the other side of Russia, which is 11 time zones away. So literally almost on the exact opposite side of the planet, more or less. It's still in the northern hemisphere, but anyway, I digress. Russia is able to do what they are able to do to everybody else, to pretty much everywhere except for Tartaria, and they never were able to go back and do that to them. Now, I'm not advocating that this should have been done. What I'm saying is that if you have a ethno-state-centric mindset, and the people who you don't care for are right in the middle of you, that makes for a very bad relationship, not only physically, but geopolitically, to where you have an existential threat right in the middle of your country that you have to police. And that has been a significant part of Russian history, even though we don't know a lot about it outside of Russia. It's a big deal in Russia, but they don't talk about it as much. Anyway, so this largely wraps up the 1500s. The 1600s and the 1700s is largely the area of Russian expansion. This will get into numerous leaders, some of them you may be familiar with. This will get into Peter, this will get into Elizabeth, and this will get into Catherine. And of course, Catherine's in the 1800s. But largely what we're getting at here is three things. One, Russia will expand. Russia will continue to expand, particularly eastward, to the point where eventually at one point or another, they will colonize Alaska. So literally 12, 13 time zones away, on the other, more or less on the other side of the planet, they will have colonies on the other from Moscow. What the Russians will have a lot more trouble with is dealing with the Europeans during this time. And basically in every direction that the Russians go, to the west or to the south, they will run into people. To the northwest at this point is that there is the great Swedish Empire, which Sweden is a major force to be reckoned with. They, just a few years, if we're talking about the 1700s and the rise of Peter the Great, before this, Sweden had largely been one of the great powers of Europe, even though it had been very unpopulated. It was largely just Sweden and Finland of today. But they were so powerful and competent that more or less they were the ones to end the 30 Years' War that allowed the the rise of the Protestants in Northern Europe to be established, and for the Holy Roman Empire to become basically a divided shell. And Sweden would largely do this. Now, granted, they had some help from the French and a few others, but it shows their power. They're dealing with great powers that are, 10 times the population, and they're able to put up a decent fight. And so, just in that direction, you have a major adversary. Directly to the west, you have the PLC, otherwise known as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and that is basically this super state that the Poles and the Lithuanians have forged together. That is relatively strong and competent. Now, it has some problems, which will eventually lead to a demise, but this is an area that, at one point, ruled pretty much all of either Eastern or Central Europe to some large degree. And this would go from the Baltic Sea of Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and would go all the way down into areas of Ukraine and Romania. And so, very large area, very powerful, not to be screwed with. Germany doesn't really exist at this point. You have the Empire of Austria and the Holy Roman Empire, and the Holy Roman Empire is this fractured monstrosity that hasn't even really seen the rise of Prussia, so we don't have to worry about them yet. To the direct south, Austria is to the south. To the southwest, you largely have the rise of what is the Austrian Empire, and for a while they looked like to be a substantial threat to the Russians. This will get even worse as Poland becomes basically a shell of its former self and implodes. But Austria is no joke for the Russians to have to deal with. They will always have to be, basically, since the three thrones of Bohemia, Hungary, and Austria come together, is that you will have the Austrians dealing with the Russians in some form here, there, and otherwhere, all the way up until the Great War of 1914-18. Finally, going directly south, you get into the number one enemy that the Russians will have here for a very long time. And of course, it is the Ottomans. And the Ottomans are no joke by any stretch of the imagination. Most people, if you play a Paradox game or so, you know how powerful the Ottomans are. And if you don't know your history, the Ottomans going from the 1400s all the way up until the 1600s, are the biggest great power of Europe. They're able to kick everyone's ass, and the Russians eventually get to a point where they are literally having to go neck and neck against the Ottomans. What will largely happen is that the Russians will be in conflict with all of these peoples plus one more, and that is the Persians to the southeast. Now, that's a little bit relative. The Persians are through the Caucasus Beltway, that is largely has two passes. One of them is around Baku in Azerbaijan. The other one is the northern passes in Georgia that straddle the Russian-Georgian border today. And you can get through the western pass there. You can get in northern Turkey and Anatolia. Through the eastern pass is the gateway to Persia, or if you will, Iran. Excuse me, I'm choked up a little bit. I apologize. Trying to put this into context. Anyway, going forward with this is that the Russians will be fighting with all of these peoples in and out almost constantly. They'll get a few respites, but usually once one war ends, another one just starts. And the Russians are able to literally just steamroll everybody, not through combined arms of providence, but really just through attrition. Because what I'm trying to paint here is that when you actually put all of Russia together, just in the eastern part of Europe, this is a massive geopolitical entity that will outnumber everybody by population. Most of all, the rivals will be combined. The next two biggest rivals largely will be combined and doubled, and Russia will still outnumber them. That's no joke. Like, literally almost everybody together combined has the population of Russia. And of course, if they don't unite, they don't destroy Russia. Now, that does not mean to say that the Russians are uber competent. In fact, most of the time, they're really crap, and they're largely seen as a technological and social backward. The Russians are largely seen as barbarians to a lot of peoples, not even deserving of European, basically of the European name and commonality. And this will slowly change over time, where Russia has to force itself into basically seen as competent. For a very long time, Russia's just kind of seen as a wedge, and you will see from time and time again where they will help coalition, and eventually what will, to show how powerful the Ottomans are, is that at the height of their power in the 1500s, is that it takes a coalition of Austria, the PLC, and Russia, and I believe this is called the Holy Alliance, but don't quote me on that one, because there's like 3 or 4 of them in history, where they all band up and tag team down on the Ottoman Empire, and it takes all of them together to defeat the Ottomans at their height. Anyway, what is also happening relatively at the same time is that the end of the Swedish Empire and the rise of the Russian Empire happens. What you have, and I'm sorry, like all my dates are getting a little confused, and as you can tell, I'm getting tired. I don't have time to do all this stuff, and I wish I did. That's why I haven't been here. Anyway, what I'm getting at is that eventually you'll have something called the Great Northern War, and that is Sweden basically gets gangbanged by Denmark, Norway, the PLC, and Russia, and they largely are getting together because they want to unite to destroy Sweden as a functional entity. What largely happens is that it's a 21-year war that eventually will be attrition to the point where the Russians will largely win, and everyone else kind of loses. Denmark, Norway is largely bumped out of the war pretty much innately because the Swedes will bang rush them and just knock them out. Largely, that's a pretty quick thing. Sweden will go in to knock out the PLC. The PLC will take a nasty beating and basically dissolve in a civil war in which the Swedes will help out one side of that's vying for the crown, and then you'll have another side which kind of the Russians are supporting, which is the side that loses more often than not. So Poland's divided, is in the midst of a civil war, and largely it becomes a Swedish versus Russian battle that will last for the better part of, well, the war itself is 21 years, but the slogfest will be the better part of 19 years. And what you'll have is that you'll have Peter the Great basically mobilizing Russia into a more Western kind of focus, to where you'll have more modern uniforms, more modern tactics, more modern weapons for the era, and they will become a largely known as European power. They'll absolutely get bodied by the Swedes. The estimated death count is that for every Swede that goes down, they'll kill 4 Russians. But largely, again, the Russian steamroller is here, and that is the Russians can just soak loss after loss after loss, where the Swedes can't. And so largely, through outmaneuvering and the fact that the Swedes can't get the Ottomans to join the war, is that the Russians, largely more or less by themselves, will wear down the Swedes. They'll actually help to the point where the Poles will get basically the person that they side with, and the Polish Civil War will regain the crown after losing countless battles, and then the Russians are able to take over the Baltic states in an area that is known as the Isthmus of Karelia, which will be a new city founded, and this will be Peter's new capital of Russia and will remain so all the way up until the Russian Revolution in 1917, 1918. This place is called St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg. Eventually it will be known as Petrograd. I don't remember why they changed the name, but they've changed the name of this place like a bunch of times. Okay, so Peter the Great comes along, basically makes the Russian Empire. Eventually you will get Elizabeth. I don't remember exactly what her claim to fame is. I think she's fighting Napoleon and she dies. She just dies of old age. It doesn't go... I'm sorry. No, this was not right. That's Alexander the Second. Okay, anyway, Alexander the First, I think. Okay, let me go back. Peter comes along. Things happen. We talked about that. The next one is Elizabeth. I don't remember what her claim to fame is. I apologize. I know she's seen as very competent. The one after that is Catherine, and she will meet... she will meet Frederick the Great of Prussia because she's originally a German. And she'll marry Peter the Third. Anyway, she eventually gets the crown, and she is largely known for kicking everybody's ass. And she'll actually be one of the people that brings down the part of the PLC. Largely, yeah, she will die. And if I remember right, she'll die in like 1801 during the rise of Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars. And then her nephew, if I remember right, takes over, which is Alexander II, and everything goes to shit for Russia for quite a bit. But I'm sorry I've got this a little out of order. I probably should have put it up in a thing, but hey, what am I going to do? I'm tired. I'm trying to just give you guys some content. Anyway, so the Russians keep expanding. Eventually, they will consistently nuke one of their enemies after long and grueling battles. First, it's Sweden, then the PLC is gone. And eventually, because the Europeans have developed deep water navigation and the rise of the East India companies, the Ottomans start dying from the inside because they no longer can facilitate their empire off of the trade that is largely being built out. And so what you'll have here is that the Russians are eventually able to start pushing back the Ottoman influence. And you'll have, basically, as soon as that becomes a point where the Russians are to the point where they know they can manhandle the Ottomans writ large, is that you have somebody else show up. And this is obviously Germany. So we're in the 1800s now, just giving it. Napoleon comes around. The Russians largely just do the heavy lifting to get to defeat Napoleon. They're the ones who will take more losses than anybody. They'll actually do most of the fighting, and they're one of the few nations that really ever don't side with Napoleon, except for once, and that's for a quick minute. But that doesn't last for very long. Eventually, they will be one of the major contributors to bringing down Napoleon. You get the Concert of Europe until you have the Crimean War, which is Russia basically going to give the knockout blow to the Ottoman Empire. It is so bad that you will have the Muslim Ottoman Empire, Sunni, combined with Catholic France and Anglican England to stop Eastern Russia, Orthodox Russia. Now, usually the religions wouldn't make alliances like that on those grounds, but this just goes to show you that Russia is getting this powerful and everybody else is getting this weak at this point. This is 1850 to 1853, or it's 1853 to 1856. Sorry, don't remember. Anyway, Russia is able to do this. Also in 1848, the Hungarian Hungarian Revolution happens, and Russia will actually invade Austria-Hungary, not to destroy Austria-Hungary, which has become a major rival at this point, but also to basically control the monarchy, because the age of liberalism has begun, and everyone's scared of basically the ideas of Napoleon gaining power and corrupting the monarchies and destroying them. So Russia will actually help their former enemy. And this will largely be, I think it's another Holy Alliance. You have Prussia, Austria, and Russia largely all allied for the better part of like 20, 30 years, and they basically police Eastern Europe together. Eventually you get the Crimean War. That happens. Bad things. The Russians will kind of draw that war. It's kind of weird. Most of it's fought in Crimea. the Russians will win Crimea, but everywhere else that they largely want to make gains, they are not able to. As soon as Russia starts feeling confident that the Austrians are largely more or less they're able to be dealt with, and the Ottomans are largely been eclipsed and are becoming the sick man of Europe, all of a sudden a new nation forms called Germany, and it scares the living hell of the Russians. Largely because of the fact that even though the Russians will swiftly ally France after the formation of Germany, is that Germany is ridiculously strong. Even though it's a brand new nation, it's basically formed by political screwy, and you got to thank Otto von Bismarck for doing his magic work. But anyway, what I'm getting at here is that a nation in the center of Europe has now formed that can take on Russia and France relatively at the same time. And that's what they'll largely do when we get to World War I. But it scares the living hell of the Russians. And of course, Germany is a major foe because basically half of the border that Russia has in the West is the border with Germany, and the other half's with the Austrian Empire, outside of just little bits and pieces here and there. The Austrians aren't much of concern because the Austrians were already dying come 1848, but they won't die until literally World War kicks off and the Russians meat grind the living crap out of them. And even after that, the Russians will lose World War I because the Germans will basically just manhandle them. But anyway, I digress. Closing out the 1800s, Russia is kind of falling back into its technological backwater parts. It's not looking very good for them. You'll have the rise of railways and industries, and Russia's really slow to adapt to this, largely because their system is largely feudal. And not only just feudal, it has serfdom, which is kind of peasant slavery, all the way up into the 1900s. Eventually, in 1905, you get Russia versus Japan. Japan being this new state that no one's really cared about. It's a Far Eastern state. Everyone thinks that the European powers can whip on them just like they whipped in China on the Opium Wars 50 years earlier. Japan is coming to show that that is not the case. And Japan will largely assert itself as one of the great powers by defeating both Russian navies, the Far East Navy and the Baltic Navy, in a naval action at the Battle of Tsushima? Yes. Decisively, utterly, and really scorns the Russians. And the Russians start looking really bad. And it becomes basically more or less this giant parable for the Russians to deal with. They look bad, they feel bad, and they need to assert that the Russians are still a major entity in the world. And this will largely culminate into what triggers off World War I, is that the Russians are falling behind, their national prestige is on the line. And so when another Slavic peoples are attacked, which Russia has kind of adapted the mantle of the defender of the Slavs, Serbia gets attacked by Austria in 1914 because of the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand. You know, this is Gabriel Princip, killing him in the car, bang. A lot of people think that Serbia is behind it. They actually might have been to some degree, but that's more of, it doesn't really matter. Austria attacks Serbia. Russia mobilizes to defend them. Germany mobilizes to defend Austria. Bang, you get World War I, and everyone's at each other's throats. Largely, the reason why the Russians couldn't step down to defend Serbia is because their national prestige is on the line, and they have to show the world that they're still a great power. And it's just one of those national pride things. I'll be talking about World War I in a video not terribly long from now. It's on the list. I'm sorry I'm not doing those videos like as much as I used to. I just don't have time. Sorry, I am complaining a little bit, but here we are. Help me out here if you guys can. It's basically what I'm trying to say. Because the more you help me, the more time I can dump into this and the less I have to worry about other crap. Okay, so World War I takes off. I'll talk about World War I in its own video to a large degree, but what innately happens here is that Russia gets its ass kicked by the Germans, even though the Russians will largely deal 1-for-1 with the Ottomans. They will absolutely manhandle the Austrians. The Germans are able to just push them back, and eventually the Russians, through a complete social breakdown, have a change of government, which will be basically the Duma of Russia or the Republic of Russia. They'll have another change of government, which leads to the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1918, Russia, now the Soviet Union, more or less, sues for peace, and they're out of World War I. They have lost an incredible swath of territory. Basically, everything of modern Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states that we see. Russia is kind of where it's at in its modern borders right now. And this is a nation that used to control all the way up past Warsaw. So all the way up into middle Poland today is they lost that entire swath of land. Now, this will kind of get screwed up again because a year later you will have the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, and you'll have the formation of a number of states that the Russians feel is part of their natural empire. And this is Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. We can also talk a little bit about Hungary and Czechoslovakia, but those are the ones that we're not going to worry about those because they don't come into a fight. Russia goes into a civil war pretty much immediately as World War I comes to an end, because the rise of the Bolsheviks has not gone without some pushback. And of course, as soon as World War I ends, a lot of nations dump their resources into funding the Russian Civil War and supporting the Russian Whites, which are basically the anti-Bolshevik forces, and they are more of a Republican forces, although they're a coalition of a bunch of people, including monarchists and a whole other group of people. Russian Civil War lasts for the better part of 4 years, and that's largely it's largely considered 1917, 1918, all the way up into 1921, more or less. And it really doesn't take off officially until 1919. What happens is that Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland, even though they're new states, are brought into this war because the Russians considered this to be part of their natural territory, and with Germany neutered by the Treaty of Versailles, Germany can't do anything about it. And so the treaty that has largely been signed with the Germans just a few years prior, they consider null and void, and they're able to try to reinvade their own territories. They'll largely subjugate Ukraine after a prolonged fight. Belarus doesn't really get to be its own nation. They'll just kind of be reintegrated back into the Russians, more or less. But the Baltic states and whatnot will rebel. And after a long, pristine fight, when it looks like the Reds are going to win, between balancing everything that's going on and foreign support, and basically these nations coming out to really punch pretty hard, especially above their weight, Russia will give up on annexing these lands, and you'll have these nations form out to themselves. And that's not going to be part of any other history, so I'm happy to talk about that one. Eventually what you'll get is that the Russians will get Stalin after a little bit of Lenin. Lenin dies in like 24. Stalin takes over after a bit of political maneuvering, and of course we get the Mac Daddy, the hammer of Stalin, who he is, and you get the 5-year plans and the industrialization of Russia. And Russia at this point really is not in good shape. Going into the early 1920s, is that it is a feudal backwater still. It had just come out of a civil war. A lot of, basically, people are having trouble getting food, unemployment sky high. Civilizational collapse has largely happened in Russia. Not too uncommon to what we've seen today, but Stalin is able to mobilize, basically by systematically defeating any kind of political and military opposition, into uniting a political force that can get some shit done. And dare I say this, and I hate to say this in any way, shape, or form, but Stalin's able to make a functioning geopolitical entity again. And largely through blood, sweat, and death, Stalin is able to put together a functional entity that will start to radically transform the Russians, now the USSR, into a superpower. Well, this will take the better part of 20 years, but going into 1925, Russia is... Sorry, we'll do 15 years. Going into 1925, Russia is in a disaster. We talked about where it was. Going into 1940 is that it is now a gigapower. It is either the second or third biggest economy in the world, maybe fourth. What largely you have is the United States is definitive number one, but you have the British Empire, Germany, and Russia all relatively in the same general level. And this is 15 years after Russia was probably like 8th. All right, so unironically, history kind of repeats itself again, in that Russia has declined massively since the fall of the Soviet Union. But anyway, 25, Russia's a joke. All of a sudden, come 1940, they have a massive economic. They have the largest standing military in the world. They've got more tanks than pretty much everybody else combined, and quite a few aircraft too. I think it's like the first or second biggest air force, rivaling like the Luftwaffe and whatnot. I think it's first actually, but they're all crappy planes. Anyway, This gets into World War II. If you want to learn about World War II, there's a 2.5 or 2 hours 40-minute episode on that in the events of geopolitics. I'm not going to get into that. But largely what has happened is the Russians will bleed horribly, and 15% of the entire Russian population is killed, and that is within the Soviet Union itself. Some places will see death rates up to 30%, so literally almost 1 in 3 people are dead. And in other areas, it won't be nearly as bad, but more or less, no matter where you are, 1 in 20 have died, no matter where you are in Russia, and then depending on certain places, it's 1 in 3. So this fundamentally scars Russia, and they already are having a baby bust because of World War I at this point. But what we have here is something that is so horrible it will leave an echo in the demographics in Russia that continually repeats all the way to this very day. The next echo is set to repeat somewhere around the late 2020s, and it will go into the 2030s to where there will be a decline in Russian birth rates and a decline in Russian demographic statistics, basically because the people that should have been there weren't born in World War I, were killed in World War II, and just never built out to fill out that generational cadre. And so basically the Russian great generation that should have existed were largely all killed. Or didn't exist at all ever. So, anyway, let's move on. We talked about the Cold War. That's its own episode entirely, and that's another 2.5-hour episode. So if you want to go check that out and get a more Russian history in spot, that's fine. We talk about that to a lot. Eventually, the Russians will be the second biggest economic power in the world and the largest military power in the world. They will swing that dick very big and very heavy, but with one of these demographic waves shifting in, which I didn't talk about in the Cold War episode, in the 80s, and particularly the late 80s, is when this demographic hollowing out happens. The Russians will economically largely go into collapse from political, demographic, and social issues. It will eventually bring the collapse of the Soviet Union, and hooray, we're to the Spotlight episode. And if anyone hasn't checked that out, the synopsis is this. Russia is a shell of its former self, and it's largely back to the state of what it largely seemed to be back in 1920. It is about the 8th biggest economy in the world, give or take. It's rivaling Italy in numbers. That's nothing to be happy about, especially for a former superpower. Their demography is not looking good, which is even worse than what they had back in the 20s. And just in a general nutshell, Russia has kind of hit the breaking point again. And it's going to take some massive good leadership to put it back together. So, where are we going forward? The difference between the 20s and now is that Putin is not Stalin. And while Putin is trying to put together his own geopolitical institutions that will stand the test of time, is that he doesn't have nearly the cadre and he doesn't have nearly the skills to replace the people that he's losing and what he needs. And so, basically the Iron Fist isn't hard enough, which is weird to say, but that's kind of what you need to rule Russia. So far, that's the only thing that's worked. So not a big enough Iron Fist. 2, the Russian people, being an ethno-state, are dying out. Most of the people that are young in Russia are not Russian. They're other peoples. They're Tartars. They're Kazakhs. They're Ukrainians. Or anybody in the proper borders of Russia that aren't Russian. And that might be 1/3 to 1/2 of their population now that is under 20 is of some descent that isn't ethnically Russian. And that scares the living shit out of the Russians. There's a reason why their draft rates have gone down massively. We're not 100% sure on this. It used to be a standing army of over 1 million people. Right now, we're seeing numbers that may be as low as 400,000. So Russia is changing, and it's changing in some ways that scares the hell out of them and everybody around. So the question remains, will Russia be able to pull this back together? Right now, 9 out of 10 things says no. But it's not the first time the Russians have pulled off a major transformation that puts them over the edge. Now, usually it's something that happens once every 200 years or 300 years. And so we can probably figure on that they're not going to pull another one out of the hat yet so soon. But we've said no before and been wrong. So I leave that as an option. And I'm sorry, I need some water. Anyway. That's largely been Russian history, and that's still a 45-minute episode, and I skipped over a lot. And I apologize for having a little bit of idiosyncrasies. I know the general outline. I just should have brought it up on the side. I'll probably do that for the next stuff. It's just, I'm just trying to get you guys some content. done is better than perfect, and right now I am stretched thin. So, without further ado, I've been Tyberius D. This has largely been a geopolitical history episode for Russia and talking a little bit about their future. I'm sorry for the Russians that you're in this state, but some of it you asked upon yourselves. So, without further ado, the next episode in the Country Spotlight, we'll be talking about oh so magnificent China. And I'm sure that's always a kicker. Everyone loves for me to talk about China. We'll be talking about that here relatively soon. I hope you all enjoy that one when it comes. Definitely check out that, whether it's on YouTube or you want to watch that on Twitch, if you guys are watching. And then be sure to check out all my other content. Mask Off is great. The reviews episode, I'm about to record another one here just after this. So without further ado, it's been fun. Been great. We've been talking about Russia. And we'll check you next time. Have a good one, guys.